The Sword and the Bread: How Revolutionaries Forged Power from Poverty. In our previous examination of political power during an age of decay, we observed how institutional climbers like Napoleon III leveraged the plight of the urban poor to outmaneuver a stagnant elite. But the calculus of power is not limited to the ballot box or the halls of a decaying republic. When societal rot reaches a critical mass, the political arena expands into the mountains, the jungles, and the rural wastelands. Here, the thesis remains the same, but the stakes are written in blood. When the establishment abandons the lowest classes, the visionary who feeds and defends them does not just win votes, they raise an army. Throughout history, the most devastatingly effective revolutionary figures understood that the dispossessed were not a burden, but a sleeping giant. By directly addressing the immediate survival needs of the impoverished, these outsiders forged fanatical loyalties, transforming bands of outcasts into unstoppable engines of historical change. Pancho Villa, the Centaur of the North. Few figures embody the weaponization of charity and redistribution quite like Francisco Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution. In the early 20th century, Mexico under the Porfiriato was a textbook decadent state. Foreign investors and a tiny elite of haciendados, plantation owners, controlled nearly all the wealth and land, reducing millions of rural peasants to landless, impoverished peons. Villa, a former bandit, understood the visceral anger of the starving masses. He did not initially come to them with complex ideological treatises. He came with bread, cattle, and a gun. As his forces swept through northern Mexico, Villa systematically expropriated the vast estates of the wealthy elite. He redistributed food, money, and land directly to the poor and established orphanages and schools. This was not merely altruism, it was brilliant military strategy. By acting as an armed Robin Hood, Villa ensured that wherever his División del Norte rode, they were shielded by the local population. The peasants became his spies, his quartermasters, and his inexhaustible recruiting pool. The decadent federal government could not defeat him because they were fighting an army, while Villa was commanding a heavily armed social welfare system. Mao Zedong, the peasant ascendancy. Decades later, half a world away, Mao Zedong applied a similar principle on an unprecedented scale. Traditional Marxist doctrine held that communist revolutions must be led by the urban, industrial working class, but China in the 1920s and 30s was overwhelmingly agrarian, and its rural peasantry was subjected to crushing poverty, famine, and warlord exploitation. Mao recognized that the true center of gravity in a decaying society lies where the suffering is most acute. He pivoted away from the cities and focused entirely on the destitute rural peasantry. His strategy was simple but world-altering: land reform. The Red Army entered impoverished villages, violently deposed the abusive landlords, and redistributed the land to the starving peasants. To the Chinese peasantry, Mao was not just a political theorist, he was the man who finally gave them the means to eat. This hyper-focus on the poorest demographic allowed Mao to employ his strategy of surrounding the cities from the countryside. The nationalist forces, backed by urban elites and foreign capital, found themselves fighting an ocean of peasants who were entirely devoted to the communist cause because it had guaranteed their basic survival. Fidel Castro, the Sierra Maestra campaign. The Cuban Revolution offers a crystalline example of this dynamic playing out in a concentrated theater. When Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and their small band of surviving guerrillas fled into the Sierra Maestra Mountains in 1956, they were a ragtag, desperate force. Fulgencio Batista's regime was corrupt, glittering with mob money in Havana, but completely indifferent to the agonizing poverty of the rural Guajiros, peasants. Castro's genius lay in his realization that to survive the mountains, he had to become the government the mountains never had. The rebels didn't just fight Batista's army. They built rudimentary hospitals, set up schools to teach the illiterate to read, and enforced strict codes of justice that protected the peasants from banditry and exploitation. They enacted agrarian reform in the liberated territories long before they ever marched on the capital. The result? The peasants fed the guerrillas, hid them from Batista's bombers, and eventually joined their ranks. The Cuban military, fighting for a paycheck and a corrupt elite, demoralized quickly when faced with a guerrilla force backed by the absolute devotion of the countryside. Castro won the country because he first won the most impoverished corners of it. The real politic of the empty stomach. The elite of a decaying society always make the same fatal miscalculation. They mistake poverty for powerlessness. Because the homeless, the landless, and the hungry lack capital and institutional influence, the establishment assumes they are politically irrelevant. Revolutionaries like Villa, Mao, and Castro proved the exact opposite. They understood that when a human being is stripped of everything, they have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. If you are the one to place a piece of bread in their hand and a weapon on their shoulder, their loyalty will transcend politics. It becomes a matter of life and death. In the twilight of any decaying age, true power is never handed down from the decaying palaces. It is forged in the dirt, traded for a meal, and carried up from the absolute bottom.